Boston exam schools are a magnet for bright students, but also a battleground over standards for admission. As a result, people in Boston have been struggling over ways to balance quality, inclusiveness, and fairness. According to a new study by researchers from Harvard's Kennedy School, part of the conflict stems from a discrepancy in standards between a special entrance exam and the standardized test based on curriculum for the Boston public schools. To tell us about the study is one of the authors, an associate professor of public policy at the Kennedy School, Joshua Goodman. Thank you very much for being with us, Joshua.
Thanks for having me.
Well, these schools have student bodies that are quite at odds with the rest of the Boston public school system, and a lot of people might conclude, well, if there's a racial gap in achievement, that must be what's reflected at these schools. But is that necessarily the case?
So we don't think that's not the entire story. That's certainly part of the story, that there are achievement gaps at earlier ages that the school district is going to need to deal with, is dealing with. But part of the point of the research we did was to say, even if you look only at the highest achieving kids in the district, regardless of race, so the kids whose MCAS scores, their fifth grade test scores, put them in the top quarter of kids in the district, even among those high scoring kids, there are still gaps in who applies to the exam schools, how they do on the entrance exam, whether they end up enrolling there. And so part of our point was to say there seem to be gaps that are separate from just pure achievement gaps.
Well, what goes on in the pipeline here? Because yes, all these students take an exam, but some, I guess, they get more preparation than others too, don't they?
That's right. So to get into the exam schools in Boston, you have to take an optional exam called the Independent Schools Entrance Exam, ISEE. It's offered for free to students, but it's optional. It's these days, I think, offered on a Saturday in a few locations around the city. And what we found is that there are racial gaps in who chooses to take that exam. Again, even comparing just the high achieving students in the Boston public schools, Black and Hispanic students are less likely to take that exam. And when they do take that exam, they tend to underperform what we would predict based on their prior test scores. And we think that's because they're not doing as much out-of-school preparation as white and Asian students are, for example. Because that independent school entrance exam covers a number of topics that don't necessarily align with what the state and city curriculum are doing.
Well, is there maybe a justification for that special exam because perhaps it might be more aligned with curriculum at the exam schools? How do you think about that?
I can understand that argument. It's certainly the case that if I were in an exam school and I wanted to select students who knew algebra in sixth grade already, that I would use an exam that tests them on algebra, even though that's not actually part of the typical public school curriculum. On the other hand, it's a little bit odd, given that the exam schools are public schools, for them to be screening students on the basis of curriculum topics that are not actually part of the public school curriculum leading up to that point in time. So it seems to me that the schools have to make a bit of a decision about what it is they're selecting students on. Are they selecting students who, because of out-of-school preparation, are particularly well prepared on a certain set of topics, or do they want to select students on the basis of how well they've fulfilled their learning as defined by the city and the state itself?
Of course, another challenge here is that the people taking the entrance exam are not exclusively students from the Boston public schools. They could be from private schools or Catholic schools. So you need one standard that's equally fair for all of those, right?
No, that's right, and that's certainly a complication here. That you're right, that students are coming both from the public schools, also from the charter sector, and from the private and parochial schools. And it certainly is a challenge to figure out what is a single objective standard that would allow you to admit students to the exam schools from all of these different streams. I think part of the point of our research was simply to point out that the entrance exam currently may not actually provide a great standard in that way because it is sort of it requires too much preparation outside of school. Plus, the system also admits students partially on the basis of their GPAs. And as we all know, whether a teacher gives me an A or a B in fifth or sixth grade is a pretty subjective standard, and one where it seems like grading standards differ quite dramatically across the private and public school sectors, where private school students are often given very high grades, partly because parents are using those schools to gain entrance into the exam schools. And so all of it's a bit of a challenge to figure out what the right set of standards are to admit students.
I know all this time we have been focusing on that entrance exam, but what is exactly the formula for admission? Is it strictly the exam? Is it some combination of other things?
So it's students, when they apply, they take this entrance exam. They also submit their GPA from 5th and I believe the beginning of 6th grade. And then they have to list which of the 3 exam schools they would most prefer to enter. And so whether a student is given an offer of admission is entirely dependent on A, which exam school they actually listed, and B, a 50% combination of that exam score and their GPA that's used to make a ranking of students.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Joshua Goodman from Harvard's Kennedy School. What about remedies here? Is there a better way to screen these students?
So I personally think of all the things that we looked at, that the most simple and compelling choice we can make would be to eliminate the independent schools entrance exam from the process and instead use as an objective standard of academic achievement the 5th grade MCAS exam, the state standardized exam that all students are required to take. So using that exam, first of all, gives us a good objective measure of students' academic skill, and it's a high-quality exam that can really identify students whose skills are worthy of attending these exam schools. And it avoids the problem that an optional test is often one that is an option that's not taken by students who are at a bit of a disadvantage, and that the test that the schools have been using up until recently, this independent schools exam, is one that requires a lot of out-of-school preparation. So the MCAS has the nice feature that everyone, at least in the public schools and the charter schools, is taking that exam, and it is in theory aligned with what they're doing in school. So it's a test of whether a student is excelling at the tasks that they've actually been given.
Now, I got into Latin. I remember I was in grade 6. I was exposed to a brutal week of cramming, but these days, what are we talking about with kids going to exam schools? I've read about kids in New York City. They start when they're 4 years old.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as I know, there are a lot of exam school preparatory courses, a lot of tutoring centers kids can go to work on these topics. The Boston Public Schools actually has its own exam schools initiative where it's trying to give these kind of services to students, but it's in a fairly compressed time frame of a couple of weeks as opposed to a year or more of that kind of preparation that a student might do. And I understand the instinct as a parent. I want my kid to be well prepared and to do extra work if I think that work will help him. But it's not clear that it makes sense to set up a system that encourages that kind of work or requires that kind of out-of-school work as a condition for access to a high-quality education.
Well, I know you're trying to be race neutral and preserve the quality here and to be fair, but I imagine there would probably be some sort of a change in the racial composition of these schools if you were to change the process.
So what we calculated is that if the district moved to a world in which the MCAS exam was used for admissions, and so that was the measure of academic achievement that was used, that it would make schools like the Boston Latin School somewhat more closely resemble the Boston Public School and the Boston population as a whole. It would not be a radical change. You know, our best guess is that it would move something like Boston Latin from being about 20% Black or Hispanic to maybe at best 30% Black or Hispanic. So that can make a big difference for those students in the school because they have more classmates that look like them, but we're not talking about sort of radically changing the student body composition, in part because there are these big achievement gaps that need to be addressed not by the exam schools themselves and not by the admissions process, but at points in time earlier than that.
I have to admit, you know, if you step back a little bit from these 3 schools and this one process, I can't help but see that there are more good students out there than there are seats for them in schools like this. Don't you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the exam schools are clearly great. I think we'd like to live in a world in which people didn't view them as the only good options. And I think there's lots of evidence that there are other Boston schools that are good for students. But I think the broader point that the goal is that everyone should have access to a high school or a middle school that is high quality is clearly the most important one.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Joshua Goodman from the Harvard Kennedy School.